Hello and welcome to Skipton Talks. My name is Rachael Hunnisett. Thank you for listening in today. You're shortly going to listen to a recent catch-up that I had with the marvellous Iona Bain, award-winning journalist, broadcaster, speaker and author. Iona is dubbed as the UK's go-to voice on millennial money, as seen on a few household names that you might just recognise, such as ITV, BBC, Sky News, Channel 4, to name just a few. During my conversation with Iona, we look at the challenges facing first-time buyers and also the reasons to be optimistic too, demystifying some common concerns as well as addressing accessibility to home ownership. Quite a lot to get through in 25 minutes. At Skipton, we recently revealed the top 40 questions that first-time buyers want to know the answers to, but are too embarrassed to ask. Among that same research, 68% of first-time buyers say that they were worried about looking stupid when talking to mortgage advisors, and 44% said that they rely on the internet for help. I hope you enjoy this discussion as much as I did. Let's dive in.
Well, firstly, thank you, Iona. Lovely to be with you today, and thank you for taking the time out. I know you're incredibly busy at the moment, so thank you for being with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Rachel.
And I'll kind of, for anyone who isn't familiar with your work, you work a lot in the kind of customer-facing side, really educating and championing, empowering the next generation, essentially, of pension savers, home buyers, people that kind of fit with our brokers, on a regular basis. And what I'm really interested to understand from you a little bit more is how we work as an industry in mortgages, intermediary-led, and what kind of tricks we're missing, I guess. So my first question to you really is, 80% of the UK mortgage market, actually it's a little bit over now, is intermediary-led. So that means, business coming through brokers. But research shows from this study that 60% of homeowners feel nervous to use a mortgage advisor, saying they're worried they'll look silly, ask the wrong questions. I think they're quite reasonable things that we all think, aren't they? Especially kind of younger generation coming through to buy properties. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a reflection of the nervousness that people feel when they're buying their first home, which is completely understandable because it's a huge decision. It's fraught with risks, and they're worried that if they get it wrong, then they're going to make it a very costly mistake. And they also fear that they're not going to get a good deal. So when they're talking to, say, a mortgage broker, they're worried that if they ask what may sound to you and I like very obvious questions, but to those people are just, real mysteries, like what conveyancing is and, what do solicitors actually do, that they'll be laughed at, and that they may end up being taken advantage of, and that mortgage broker might sense, well, actually, this person doesn't really understand how this all works. So here's an opportunity here for me to perhaps get the better of them. So that's what people fear. And so they don't want to demonstrate that they don't know, enough about this subject. But I guess my response to that is that it's totally understandable that people are unaware of all the ins and outs of buying a home, because it's not something that we do that often. And we go to brokers precisely because they're the ones with the in-house expertise. But we really need to trust them that they are acting in our interests, that they aren't going to take advantage of maybe gaps in our knowledge that we'll have, and that they are going to, always have us in mind. And also that they're going to recognize that we're only human, and that we appreciate things in black and white, and appreciate, plain English, and, anything that we can do as an industry to remove the jargon from financial services, I think is going to make an absolutely huge difference, because it's very tempting to show your expertise by using lots of jargon. And I've certainly done that in my time, but actually it shows much greater skill to be able to talk about things in a straightforward, clear way. And I think it's great that Skipton's leading the way in this regard, and that they've decided to answer these common questions that first-time buyers have about the whole home buying process in a very straightforward, jargon-free way. And I think the whole industry's got a lot to learn from that.
Really, really kind of you say that. I think we've all been to a seminar, haven't we, or listened to someone speak and thought, am I the only one who doesn't really understand any of these abbreviations? I think it's really normal. Think back to what you opened with around that. I don't want to say mistrust, but almost that stigma, I guess, of who do I know how to trust, and am I going to be a bit bamboozled, I guess, with information? Is that a generational thing? Is that a cultural thing? Where do you think that stems from?
I think it's partly a reflection of how complicated the home buying process is today, and the fact that it's not as straightforward as it used to be, and it is riskier. And I've heard lots of people have real horror stories in recent times whereby they've gone through about 80% of the process. They've had a lot of the legal checks done. They've got their mortgage offer in place. They've already paid for a survey, things like that. And then at the last minute, the seller pulls out and they are, thousands of pounds out of pocket. And so I think that the risks inherent in buying a home now means that the younger generation do feel a greater deal of trepidation when they're talking to solicitors, estate agents, mortgage brokers, and so on. And I think that, the younger generation are just having a harder time when it comes to getting on the housing ladder in the first place. And they will have, saved every last penny, made really serious cutbacks in their life, or borrowed a lot of money from their parents, or a combination of all three, most likely, in order to really be in a position to be talking to a mortgage broker. And so they're really, they're putting themselves in the hands of this other person. And they naturally are going to feel extremely nervous about, what that might lead to and what the outcome of that might be. So, yeah, we can definitely do more to put first-time buyers at ease and help them realize that, their hard effort in saving for their first home, isn't going to be in vain, that they're in good hands, that they can trust the person that they're speaking to, and that they know that, that broker is going to be acting in their interests.
Absolutely. I've read your book, as I mentioned to you earlier, and I'm sure we can link it up to it at the end, but, what you called the baked bean days, I really related to that, when you say save and get on the ladder. And you're absolutely right. And I think more so now, with more generations having had a completely different house buying experience to us, some of the advice and wisdom that's passed down from kind of grandparents and parents just isn't, relative really at all. And it can be difficult, can't it, with your first time buyer? Who do you trust and turn to for that information? I think we've got distance to travel is probably too hard a word, but what can we do as an industry, as who traditionally deal quite B2B really, as mortgage lenders, working closely with brokers? What can we do as an industry to really open the doors and say, look, we're a friendly place, we're here for you, we're really putting the customer first, we're looking at lots of different options. What do you think what change would you like to see?
Well, it's very easy for me to comment from the outside, not kind of fully knowing and understanding what it's like to work within the industry. And I'm sure that, lenders and brokers alike are working incredibly hard to try to be fair to first-time buyers and to try to, really act in their interests. Having said that, I think that, it always helps to, shout about the good work that you're doing and to promote yourselves and get yourselves out there, and I think it's not just about having an account on social media and doing all the right things on there, but it's also about having just that friendly presence online, through a website. And then when anybody comes through to speak to you, just having a really kind of radically down to earth, transparent and jargon free approach to all your customer services, and making sure that, at no point will somebody feel when they're dealing with you that they are speaking to some lofty expert who is going to kind of put them down, make them feel silly, and kind of almost judge that person if they ask what seems like an obvious question. So yeah, kind of reassuring a buyer that there is no such thing as a silly question, that it's okay not to know the answers, and that's what you're there for. You're the expert. You're the one who can kind of shine a light on all these dark areas, and guide that first-time buyer through the whole process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as well as a lender, even working business, you've different people coming in, newer to industry, perhaps have been doing it a long time. Things change, don't they? And keep really breaking down those barriers is really important, actually. I mentioned I've read your book, Own It, which is very good and everyone should read it. And one of the things that really stood out to me, Iona, was the ability, and this is why I think that, this is quite a good partnership, with the ability that you have to make financial information digestible and understandable to people of our generation. And I imagine you get lots and lots of feedback about that from your audience around taking control of their experience, taking control of their own financial future, and of course when they're buying their first home, thinking about that process, what do you think the biggest challenges are at the moment in terms of getting onto the housing ladder for first-time buyers?
Well, obviously, raising enough of a deposit is a huge challenge for first-time buyers whilst house prices remain incredibly high. And yes, there are lenders out there who are prepared to offer 95% LTV mortgages. The choice in that particular market maybe isn't huge, and therefore first-time buyers, will still be at a disadvantage if they can't raise a higher deposit. And I often recommend to first-time buyers, if they possibly can, to save up more, simply because, not only will they get a greater choice of mortgages, but they'll just be in a less risky position if the market were to reverse. They won't have such a high chance of getting into negative equity, for instance, and their mortgage rates will be more competitive and cheaper. So that's what I recommend. But I've got to face up to the fact, a lot of younger people just will not be able to save up a 10 or 15% deposit in some parts of the country. Will seem like a miracle to many. And then beyond that, the fact that typically you're only going to get, a multiple of, 4.5 times your salary means that if you are on a lower income, and you are looking to buy in those more expensive parts of the country, even if you have saved up, you're still going to find it hard to get access to mortgages. But I do think that there is a glimmer of hope for first-time buyers now with interest rates rising. Yes, that means mortgages are going to get more expensive in the future, but it could also lead to a bit of a slowdown in some parts of the country. And if that happens, then it provides a window of opportunity for first-time buyers to get on the ladder and to, finally, buy that first home that was previously out of reach. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. And I think a big part of my job has been over the piece to try and get young people to appreciate that, the headlines do not always show you the world as it is. They don't give you a truly accurate picture of what's going on out there, because they can't do. They can only reflect general trends that are happening. But within your area and, concerning the houses that you might be interested in buying, the picture on the ground might be more nuanced. And actually, perhaps housing is more affordable than you think, especially if you're aware of all the little tips and tricks that I recommend, such as the lifetime ISA. If you can use those to try and supercharge your saving, then you might be pleasantly surprised at what is possible.
A really clear explanation of a market that's very nuanced there. I love that. You mentioned a bit earlier about Bank of Mum and Dad and saving for that deposit, and the more money you get behind you, the kind of stronger position you're in. Last year, 56% of first-time buyers were supported by Bank of Mum and Dad. If Bank of Mum and Dad were a lender, they'd be the 9th largest lender in the UK, so bigger than Skipton as a lender. One of the things we think about a lot is that's really good for those that have that family support. But what about all of the families and the next generation of buyers who perhaps won't have that first family support, whether that's because they don't come from affluent backgrounds, or maybe it's because their parents want to enjoy their retirement that they've worked hard for, and not dwindle their kind of life lifestyle choices as they get older. So, what do you think we're doing enough to make home ownership accessible? I guess would be my first question.
Yeah, it's an absolutely huge question, Rachel, and you're right to point out what a massive role the Bank of Mum and Dad is playing in mortgage lending at the moment. I think that to be realistic, younger people are going to have a far harder time getting on the housing ladder if they don't have any help from either the Bank of Mum and Dad, or the Bank of Granny and Granddad, or any kind of family support for that matter. And I mean, I've described this in the past as being not so much a difference between the haves and the have-nots, but the difference between the have-helps and have-no-helps. And I think I wrote in my book that we get very hung up on intergenerational inequality, this idea that the baby boomer generation are far better off than millennials because they generally own their own homes. They've seen the value of those homes go up, and therefore they're sitting on tremendous housing wealth compared to young people who are spending huge amounts on renting and have got nothing to show for it. But actually, I think that we should be more hung up on intra-generational inequality. That is the fact that there will be younger people out there who will be very well off as a result of their parents being prepared to help them. And as you say, actually, some parents might themselves be in a pretty good position, but just have this notion that younger people ought to stand on their own 2 feet and that maybe they don't deserve support with their first deposit. Now, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right attitude. And I think that sometimes the older generations kind of labour under this illusion that younger people can't get on the housing ladder because they're spending too much money on Netflix and takeaways. And I think we know that's just not true.
When we should look to essential brands, no?
Yeah, well, indeed, yeah. And the fact that, housing has raced so far ahead of people's wages, and that you're having to borrow, huge multiples of your salaries now, show that actually the reality is very different now for the younger generations. But I think that the Bank of Mum and Dad will continue to play a huge role in the future. But actually, we're already seeing the strain on the Bank of Mum and Dad. Recently, I've been reading reports and hearing from younger people who've had loans from their parents to get their first deposit, and then actually the parents have been asking for some of that money back. They originally gave their children that money, but then they said, actually, we want to turn this into a loan now, and we do expect you to pay it back at some point. And the young people in question have had a bit of a shock because they didn't expect to have to pay that money back, and they were given to understand that they were being given the money. So that's tough. I think, the cost of living crisis is going to affect all generations, and older people might not be in a position to lend to younger people. So I think that's why we need to address these structural problems within the housing market, which is a whole other debate for another day. But essentially, making sure that we do have enough houses to meet the demand that's out there, which is just not happening at the moment. We're not building enough homes. And in the meantime, we're stoking up a lot of pressure on the demand side without alleviating that pressure on the supply side. And that's just going to lead to higher house prices and younger people having an even more difficult time getting on the housing ladder in the future.
That critical supply and demand balance that we always talk about. I think you make a really good point. No one could ever foresee, inflation record highs, or at least for the first time in a while, and to have to recall your deposit that you've gifted your child, I imagine, is such a difficult thing, and then such a difficult thing for both the parent and for then the adult child to deal with, and puts incredible stress on families and those kind of family pressures. And we can't be working towards an environment where that's going to be the norm, can we? Or even more common than it is now.
Well, I think that when it comes to money, when you get your family or your friends involved in your finances, then you are definitely entering risky territory, and you are potentially endangering those relationships. If you can cooperate with your friends or your family in terms of your finances, then that is always going to be to your benefit, and it's going to lead to more efficient estate planning, for instance. But things can go wrong, and when that happens, you're not only going to end up in a worse financial position, but your relationship with that person is going to be harmed as well. And therefore, I think that relying on families to help in this situation is not ideal, and we need to make sure that younger people who can't or won't borrow from family members have other means of getting on the housing ladder.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I really love about your blog and the work that I've seen you put out is that you're a big advocate of advice. And of course, in our community, we would absolutely welcome that and advice, but also really practical about how you can go about getting that and the different options available to people. I think it's really important. The more informed we are, the better. One of the questions I kind of wanted to put to you is, if you had one message to share to the sort of 13 to 15,000 mortgage brokers that there currently are in the UK, what would that message be?
Wow, I would say, don't be afraid to reach out to that younger generation and make them aware that you are there for them, and that you have got the expertise that they're crying out for, and that you can be trusted. Because I think right now younger people are going online trying to get answers to a lot of these questions. And they're not always getting reliable answers. There are lots of people who are setting themselves up as influencers and experts who, might have the best will in the world and might have good intentions, but they're not going to be as knowledgeable as a mortgage broker who has been dealing with this stuff day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out, and has a better understanding than what is actually going on in the mortgage market right now than anyone else, myself included. And so I always say to people when they are starting down this road, don't hesitate to go and talk to a good mortgage broker, because I just know from my experience, my broker has been an absolute superhero. They helped me find my first mortgage when I was self-employed, because as we know, that can be a very tricky demographic, and mortgage lenders can feel nervous when it comes to lending to the self-employed. And also when I was getting my first solo mortgage as well, my broker was brilliant in finding a lender who was prepared to lend to me on my own. And I don't think I could have done it on my own. And I think that's the most important thing, to kind of reach out and help young people understand that they don't have to do this stuff on their own. They don't have to know it all. It's okay to admit that there are gaps in your knowledge. Come to the experts and don't worry, we will hold your hand and we will take you through this.
That's really, really good advice to all the brokers kind of listening in. I think the more we can do to break down those barriers and be accessible, and I think there's a lot we can learn from you in that respect with with making things accessible in a language that we all speak, in using language you can relate to, and using examples of things that just make it a bit simpler than using jargon and using different kind of old nuanced ways of making something that is quite complex still complex. Let's take something complex, make it accessible, and empower people with the information they can have.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well as just breaking down the whole process, saying, I understand that this term, it sounds a bit strange. Like, I understand, for instance, that stamp duty is a bit of a weird, anachronistic term, and that, you might think that this is a really bonkers way to describe basically a kind of land tax that we all have to pay. But, having that acknowledgement that some of these terms are pretty silly, or, they're pretty old fashioned or whatever, will really engender a bond with the first time buyer and really help to build trust. Because if you kind of make out that you're totally on board with all this jargon, you totally understand why it's all there, then they might think this person's they're not really on my level. Whereas if you acknowledge, some of this might seem a bit silly, I'll just explain what it means to you in plain English, they'll go, oh, okay, fine, it's not so scary, I understand it all now.
The first person I worked for when I don't think you mind me saying, when I first started out broking, it said to me, everything was SDLT. It was never stamp duty. It had to be, and that just reminded me of that story. You just think, oh, come on, let's just make it really inclusive for everyone to, to be on your wavelengths. I think,
no acronyms, ban acronyms, because they can just end up being so overwhelming and confusing after a while.
And distracting too, because you can then start thinking, I know if I'm at an event and someone's using a lot of acronyms, I think, what could that possibly stand for? And my brain has then wandered off into a new place where I'm thinking of all kinds of funny different things that can stand for in place of what it may or may not. So that's really, really interesting. Well, thank you so much, firstly, for taking the time to engage with brokers in this way. I think really important that we begin to bridge that gap and begin to really support the next generation of first-time buyers coming through. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Rachel. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, I really hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Thank you for listening. Question I'd put to you is, do you know the answers to all of those questions? And if you do your clients know that they can turn to you for those answers? Thank you for listening.